lived, or?
I guess, where did you live before you went to college?
Oh, okay, I was born in Colita, Illinois, back in 1921, December 16th, 1921. My dad was going to Garrett Institute, which was a Bible school at Northwestern. And while he had pastorates and as a student, I was at the second one. I was the second grandchild of my grandparents. And after Colita, we moved to Virginia. I lived in Herndon, Virginia. This is outside of Washington, D.C. We lived there a couple of years. And then I went from there to Machias, New York, which is up in the western central part of New York State. From there, we went south. We went to Shingle House, Pennsylvania. And I don't remember the exact dates. I can just tell you that I was about 3 years old when we went to Shingle House. And that Shingle House, my first experience of problems was when I fell and broke my leg at 3 years old.
Oh.
And my mother had asked me to pick up my toys out of the backyard because it was getting late in the evening and it's almost time to go to bed. So I didn't really want to do it. So I guess grumpily I went out to pick them up, and I tried to get them all at once so I would only have to make one trip. I was coming up the steps on the back porch and I fell and broke my leg.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and after we lived in the Shingle House, we moved to Silver Springs, New York, which is a home, at that time was a home of what they call a salt plant. Worcester Salt had a plant there, and we lived there. Again, I don't remember the exact number of years, but we lived there until I was ready to start school, and then we moved to Friendship, New York. And Friendship, New York was my first 5 years of school. We lived there for 5 years. And while we lived there, we had our baby sister was born.
What's her name?
And her name was Sonia, Sonia. And after 5 years in Friendship, we moved to Medina, New York. That's up in the south of Lake Ontario, above mid-state. We lived there about 3 years. And the reason we see so much movement was my dad was a Methodist minister, and they said that they used to tell us that 3 years was about average in the town. Mm. So from Medina, we moved to Gowanda, New York. I had my first 2 years of high school in Gowanda, which was on the edge of an Indian reservation. We had lots of American Indian children in our high school I went to in Gowanda. And from Gowanda, I moved to Elmira, New York, where my dad was pastor of the Pennsylvania Avenue Baptist Church. And my last 2 years of high school were in Elmira. and graduated from high school in 1939 from Southside High School. And from there, I was able to get to college, and I went to Houghton College in Houghton, New York, for my first 2 years of college. And I met...
What did you study?
Pardon me?
What did you study in college?
Oh, we lived in a private home, and most of the fellows at Houghton lived in private homes and rented a room. And there were 4 of us, and we used to call ourselves Houghton House. And the 4 of us, as far as I know, I'm the last one living. I don't remember exactly when the other 3 fellas passed away, but I know they're all gone. And after Houghton College, I went to American University in Washington, D.C. And it was there that my draft number came up in World War II, and so I signed up to be a aviation cadet, and I wanted to be a pilot. And so during my first year down there at AU, I was called to active duty, and I was sent to Maxwell Field for pre-flight, what they call pre-flight. Maxwell Field is Montgomery, Alabama. From pre-flight, I went to primary flight training, which was Ocala, Florida. We flew Stearman's, PT-17 Stearman, and I soloed that and had an extra 25 hours, got about 90 hours total time in the Stearman and primary. And from primary, went to basic flight school, where we flew what we used to call Vultee vibrators. They were known as BT-13. And I got through the BT-13 in the last half of basic flight school. Those that wanted, applied for the change were transferred over to the other end of the field, where we were taught how to fly AT-10s, which was a multi-engine aircraft. And we flew and soloed that airplane before we went to advanced. And I went from Bainbridge Basic Flight School to Albany, Georgia, to Turner Air Force Base, which was an advanced last flight training before we supposedly got commissioned. And at Turner Field, I flew B-25s, and that was the first combat-sized aircraft we flew, and I soloed that. Seemed to be doing okay, but 12 days before my graduation to become a pilot, they decided to eliminate me from pilot training. And they sent me to navigation school to become a navigator. And I went to navigation school, and needless to say, I wasn't too happy about being eliminated from pilot training. And one of the instructors in our flight school at Albany was a friend of mine from college, and he told me not to be too upset. He said they had to eliminate a certain number of those that were qualified for navigation, and because they needed more navigators. So that's supposedly the reason I got eliminated from flight training 12 days before becoming a pilot. Well, I got through navigation school, And at navigation school, I was sent to a classification center in Nashville, Tennessee. And in Nashville, Tennessee, I was assigned to B-24s, and they assigned crews because there were pilots, bombarders, navigators, and gunners at Lincoln Army Air Base. And I was assigned a crew, and as a crew, we were sent for overseas training at Pueblo, Colorado. At Pueblo, Colorado, we checked out in a B-24 Liberator bomber. We had pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, and 6 gunners. We had an engineer and a radio operator also out of the 10. And from there, from graduating from Pueblo, I was sent to Walla Walla, Washington. In Walla Walla, Washington, they let us sit and wait around for our overseas assignment. They sent us to California to assignment center, and after we got there, we finally got our overseas assignment. And our crew was sent to India. In India, we landed in Calcutta, India, and from there we were assigned an air base in India. That air base was Tezpur, T-E-Z-P-U-R, Tezpur Army Airfield. And that was up in the Assam Valley on the Brahmaputra River. We flew the hump, which was over the mountains from India into China. And we were a gas hauling outfit, essentially. And we hauled gas to be stored over in China for the moving up of our next station. And we went from, let's see, we went from Tezpur. They sent some of us, took some of us navigators and sent us to a combat cargo group, which was C-46 aircraft. And the combat cargo group was in Burma, and it was our air base was on the edge of the Brahmaputra River. Don't ask me how to spell it, I don't remember. But anyway, that's where we were when we were told that we could finally go home when the war was over. And so we were sent down to Calcutta, where we were stationed for a very few days, and we got assigned a flight back to the States, which was headed toward West Palm Beach, Florida. So from Calcutta, we flew west, and then went through, and I try to remember the places we were at. Well, one notable place was Cairo, Egypt. We got a chance to see the pyramids and the Sphinx, and look at some of the other places around the town for 2 or 3 days before our next flight went to the next stopover. And that got us to Casablanca, which is in the northwestern part of Florida. I mean, the northwestern part of Africa. And from there we flew down to the Ascension Islands in the South Atlantic. From the Ascension Islands, we flew to, let's see, where was it? Well, we flew to West Palm Beach. I think that's the way it was. I may have made a mistake there.
Oh, that's okay.
But when we got to West Palm Beach, we went through the separation process, the separation from active duty. And I went home, got a train, went home to Rochester, where I saw Esther and our first son, Paul Jr. He was born in January '46, and let's see, I might have a date or two mixed up in there someplace, but you'll have to forgive me for that. So from that time back in Rochester, I had been in attendance at American University, and I decided to go back and finish up. So Esther and I and Paul Jr. went down to Washington, D.C., and lived on the campus in Veterans Housing. And while we were there, I finished my college, university degree, and while we were there at AU, my older sister, Cliff Dean, was the head nurse in the school infirmary, and Esther got a job as a nurse there for the time I was left in college, which helped us immensely. And this spring of '48, I graduated from AU and went to work as a biologist at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda. While I was there, I became acquainted with the Navy Medical Service Corps, and they had just started a recruiting program for aviation physiologists, which entitled one to be later called, at the end of my career, we were known as aerospace physiologists. I don't know how much further you want me to go.
Oh, well, when did you meet Grandma?
Oh, I met your grandmother right after I became a navigator. I was home on leave, and she and her sister Florence came over to our house because my sister had invited them to go to our Christmas service at our church. So I met your grandmother at the house at our home in Rochester on Ridgeway Avenue. And after I met your grandmother, I sort of was attracted to her, and a day or so later I said to my sister, I said, I wonder if she'd go out on a date with me if I called her. And my sister said, well, you only know if you ask. So I picked up the phone and called Esther, asked her for a date, and she accepted. And our first date was a movie downtown Rochester. We began seeing each other and fell in love. And she came out to see me when I was in Pueblo, Colorado. And it was there that we had already decided we were in love with each other and we wanted to get married. And my dad came out he liked to ride trains. He came out to Pueblo on train, and arrangements were made, and he married us in a church in Pueblo, Colorado, March the 14th, 1945. And we lived there up to the time I previously stated. We lived there, and I guess the best next thing was any more questions.
Before you got married, you used to talk about a time that you visited Grandma while she was in the hospital, while she was working, and she saw you, and she made a reference to that you guys weren't married yet, but she was almost stating that you guys were engaged to be married.
Well, you remember that. I don't remember her saying that, but she probably said it to you.
Oh.
But that's factual. I don't know what else I could add to that, particularly because it's accurate.
What was the hardest thing about raising two boys?
Well, they had a strong mother, and she loved them dearly, and as I did, of course, but she was rather more than I was, and we both tried to raise her as God would want us to raise them, to love the Lord. They both became Christians in their early life. And your dad, David, was called to be a pastor. And he told me one night we were visiting Uncle Richard and Aunt Florence in West Palm Beach. And he and I slept in the same room. And he was telling me about a dream he'd had. He told me he was out walking in the neighborhood. We were living in Woodbridge at the time, Woodbridge, Virginia. And there's a man out in the street, either behind him or alongside him, and he kept throwing pebbles towards David so it would get David's attention. This is the way I remember it. And he saw who it was. He said, "Yes, Lord, what can I do? What do you want?" And Jesus said that he wanted David to be a minister. Now, up to that time, David had other plans, but he accepted the Lord's call, went to the University of Richmond, graduated, and was accepted in Southern Baptist Seminary in Fort Worth, where he went to seminary. And I believe it was in his first year, he had already met Brenda, and they got married after, I believe it was, I'm trying to get dates straight, so we'll just have to forget dates, because I'm getting to a point where I don't remember exact dates because I wasn't right on top of them. Any other questions? No more? Well, I hope that I've giving you information that maybe you didn't know before, but now you know something about your granddad.
Yeah.